Andy, do you know?
Okay, so this morning in our class on Afterlife, this is class number 2, we're going to look at Sheol, which is the place of the dead in the Hebrew scriptures. But we're going to look not just at what it is, but how it functions. And when I talk about how it functions, what I mean by that is, why are mentions of Sheol even present in the first place? And what are they doing, right? When we read stuff, particularly in the prophetic world and in the narrative worlds and the poetic worlds of the Old Testament, the texts do a couple of things. One is that they say things, right? They have content and information. But texts also do things, right? They intend to convey certain messages, or they want us to understand something. And like we talked about last week, and we'll mention again this week, the different types of literature in the Old Testament are very different from each other, and they do different things, right? Like poetry, we kind of know this. Poetry does something different than a narrative story in terms of how it conveys information. And yet you have something like, wisdom literature has even a different aim from that. Apocalyptic literature, which is often has lots of images, talking about ways of conceiving the future, are yet different still, right? So we want to kind of look at, particularly this morning, how a few of those work to talk about this place of Sheol, which is the place of the dead. So, now just really quickly, Sheol is envisioned in the Hebrew scriptures as the underworld, right? It's the place of the dead. Everybody goes there, right? It's not hell. It's not a place of punishment. But it is a place where the dead are thought to go, right? And so in the Hebrew thought world, you have this sort of tripartite way of looking at the universe. You have the waters above the firmament. We read about that in Genesis. You have the sky that has that's above the earth. You have the earth, which is conceived as relatively flat. And then underneath, you have this underworld, and then below that, you have this great deep, right? You get some sense of this cosmology, for example, when you read in the book of Exodus, the prohibition of images, right? You shall not make for yourself anything in the likeness of something that is in the heavens above, or the earth or earth below, right? So you get different senses of these, of how this works. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today is this place called Sheol, which is envisioned as something under the earth, right? It's not the deep below, but it's something below the earth. Again, it's a place of the dead, and all the dead go there, right? The righteous and the unrighteous alike. So we remember the two forces we talked about last week that kind of govern this type of thinking. In the Old Testament, you've got the force of life and the force of death, right? Now, when we talk about Sheol, it is actually personified in some places as a place that has a power to it, right? It's not the same thing, but it's similar to how we read about the first mention of sin in the Hebrew scripture, which is actually Genesis 4, when God says to Cain, sin is crouching at your door and it desires to have you. Remember that passage, right? That's the actual first mention of sin as a thing. and it's animated there, right? It desires to have you, right? I think of it like a suction, right? I guess the best visual I have of that is go home and take your vacuum cleaner and turn it on and don't put anything over the hose and put your hand over it. You know how it goes, right? That kind of suction, that's the idea, right? There's this devouring power that's attributed to things that lead to death, right? And so I'll show you in a minute where a couple of these are, but Sheol has that kind of animation to it, right? It's like a suction that goes around sucking things into it, right? And it's like an appetite, right? If remember when your kids were like devouring food at the table, you know, you could feed them enough, they just devoured everything. Well, that's that same idea. So in the conversation around Sheol, remember these are the different types of literature, the different types of expression that we find. In this world of the Old Testament, there are 66 mentions of Sheol, right? You're not going to necessarily find that in the English Bible because Sheol is given all kinds of different translations. Sometimes it's called the pit, sometimes it's called the grave, sometimes it's even called death. Usually in your Bibles, you'll have a little translational note that will tell you that this is the word Sheol. It's a little bit hard to tease out in English, but if you reading it through the Hebrew lens, there's 66 occurrences, which is, if you think about Genesis to Malachi, that's a lot of words, right? I mean, that's 39 very dense, a lot of books. To only have 66 mentions, that's not very many at all, which says that this is really not this is not a topic that the writers thought very much about, right? So that's why it's important that when it is used, we figure out, okay, so what are they trying to do, right? It's not like an instruction book where you can go to the table of contents and look up what happens when you die. Go to this chapter and it's going to give you exactly everything that happens, right? That doesn't exist, right? You have to tease this out for all these different parts. So if I were to take those 66 and I were to map them onto this, what you would find is that the majority of the mentions, right, are in the poetic, the Psalms, and in the prophetic literature with wisdom coming in third, right? That's where about half of it is. The others are just scattered mentions. So that's what we're going to do. This morning, we're going to look at how Sheol functions, why it's there, what it's doing, how the writers use this topic in each of these three areas. Okay, that's where we're going this morning. Give us an idea. Now, out of this, these three these categories of descriptions, that's going to help us understand what the Old Testament wants to tell us about this place of death. So let's start in the Psalms, right? In the Psalms, when Sheol, the death, the grave, the pit is mentioned, it is generally connected to an expression of a loss of power or a loss of agency, right? Now, remember that the writers talking about Sheol aren't in Sheol. They're still alive, right? So they're writing it from the perspective generally of what they are expecting or what they are afraid of. The mention of Sheol in the Psalms is generally, not always, but generally connected to a fear of losing one's self or losing one's ability, losing one's strength, losing one's power, right? So for example, where is it? Where'd it go? Here we are. In Psalm 88, right? There is my soul is full of trouble and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down into the pit. I am like a strong man who has no strength, right? And so it's this is I think a good representation of several others. But it's now the other thing I want you to notice, we don't have time to go through lining all of them up. But one thing you would notice is that this kind of a fear is generally associated with male figures, right? You don't have women saying these things. You have men saying these things, right? And that's going to be important when we look at how Sheol depicts fallen warriors and fallen kings, right? It's all about loss of power, right? What is the most threatening thing, the most thing that males in the ancient world feared? Well, it was not being male, right? It was losing power. It was losing authority. It was losing a position, right? And so when the psalmist is talking about trouble, right? In there, you're talking about losing your life. It's really interesting to think about, okay, well, if you're near death, what is it you're thinking about? Well, what the psalmist is thinking about here is, I'm like a man who doesn't have any strength, right? And think about what else they could have said, but didn't, right? What they could have talked about was, I'm going to be separated from my friends. I'm going to be separated from my loved ones. I'm going to be separated from God even, right? Which does come up, right? But here, strength is something that is particularly important. So Sheol here is used as a means of talking about that kind of anxiety. If we look at it in the wisdom literature, now in our English Bibles, we lump Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, all of that gets lumped into a category called wisdom. Okay, that is a Western Christian construction. That is not a Jewish construction, right? In the Hebrew Bible, those are in a different category, right? But for our purposes here, I think we can talk about it sort of the way we're used to seeing it, because Sheol is used not so much to talk about loss of strength, but it's used to talk about caution in life. Right? And it's also used to talk about death as the great equalizer. Okay. So let's look at one of those mentions. Proverbs. Proverbs 7:24-27. Do not let your hearts turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many are those she has laid low, and numerous are her victims. Her house is the highway to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. Right? So what's this a caution about? This is in Proverbs, the very first part of Proverbs, which is generally the counsel of a father to a son, right? A parent giving wisdom to his children, right? That's the context. So if you're saying something like this, how is death functioning? This mention of Sheol. Mention to say what? Yeah.
It's a woman with power.
Huh?
As a woman with power.
It's a woman with power.
Yeah.
And why that's right. Yeah. Able to topple you.
Yeah.
As a man.
Yeah.
Right. We could talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
Yep.
Stick with the nice Jewish girl.
Huh?
Stick with the nice Jewish
Oh my
girl.
goodness. This I want to say, just to be fair, this passage is so problematic, right? This is so many issues with it. One, because you are making this equation with women and power and death. Now, why? Let's think a little bit deeply. Why would you do that? What is it about a woman that is so dangerous? Yeah.
Well, I think maybe one of the main concerns was that they turn them to their other gods.
Okay, keep going with
And
that.
it's such a basic. Well, the male-female connection is such a basic human
Mhm.
want, need. That you may not even consciously think that what you're giving to someone and what you're trusting. You don't even consciously maybe feel that you trust them,
Mhm.
but. And then they can turn away from Yahweh to these other gods,
And why is that a problem?
because Yahweh is the only true God.
Yeah,
They're
I mean,
turned away
that's.
from-
Mhm. And so, but why can't the man just say no?
He could. He's weak. He's not strong, he's really weak. And
Yeah, there's all kinds of vulnerability here. It's super, super vulnerable, right? And so when you start talking about, death going down into these chambers, this woman that the Proverbs is typically associated with whom? Yes. Yeah.
No, I wasn't gonna answer the question, I was gonna ask.
Okay, go ahead.
We go back to Adam and Eve here?
That is, okay, that's a great question because yes, right?
I mean, she made him eat the apple. Or not made him.
yeah.
Let's back up.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, he had a lot of wives and concubines and things like this, so he might have had quite a few children.
Do you find it ironic that Solomon is associated with wisdom? I mean, given his end, right? The kingdom was divided because of it. Right? You had this very wise person whose life was not one of wisdom. I mean, it's an incredible irony in the Old Testament because, at the very end of his life, he had supposedly all this wisdom, but yet cavorted with so many women, so much that exactly what you said happened. His heart turned away from the living God, and as a result, the kingdom was divided. And what happened after the kingdom was divided? Did it ever unite again? No, it fell into captivity twice. The whole thing was a disaster, right? And so the wisdom literature, to your point, has this incredible relationship with Torah, right? Which is Genesis to Deuteronomy, right? So the stories early on in Genesis actually have a wisdom color, right? They talk to each other. And the reason is, but I'll show you an example in a minute of this, is that the basic human drama throughout the Old Testament is we have been made with agency. And will we make good choices or not? And that's the very first story, right? It's about agency, right? Here's,
I don't wanna set us back here, but forgive my stupidity. Or whatever you want to call it. If Genesis is the book of creation, where's Sheol in Genesis?
it's not there.
Well.
I mean,
made it?
it's
Who created it?
assumed
Why
to be there.
does it exist? In the Old Testament?
Well, that is what
Where'd it
we're,
come from?
that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, if God is the creator of everything.
Well, what you just said brings me to a question I had in your last week's notes, which I went over. In Isaiah, there is a statement that God is in control of everything and all aspects of creation, both good and evil. I make well-being shalom
Right,
and create calamity.
right.
That's the God of love,
Well,
creates calamity.
it's,
I need help here.
it's a God who, the confession in Isaiah is one of God being the total creator of everything.
I get it, so he can bring an earthquake if he wants to. I get it.
Mhm.
I'm a simple guy.
Yeah.
Okay, please, if you're getting an impression, you're absolutely dead on. I'm still wrestling with this, where does the Sheol come from? Why does it exist? Did God create it? And if he did, why?
Well, it's a way of talking
Why
about,
can't we just talk about, why didn't he just tell us about heaven?
well, because there was my understanding of it, right, which is still not the only one, but my understanding of Sheol is because it's a way that people in the writers of the Hebrew Bible talk about what happens when you die. Where do the dead go?
So it would be a human creation,
In many ways, yes,
okay?
but it's attributed, right? I think that's the anxiety in the Old Testament is what does happen to you when you die? Because there is no mention of heaven. That comes later in the New Testament.
In the New Testament.
In the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, we don't have that
Right.
yet.
Yeah.
Mhm.
On a lot of topics, I think we've noted that there's a developmental quality to scripture.
Mhm.
And so you're starting from their earliest
Earliest
most primitive
ideas.
understandings. God has revealed this much and no more.
Right.
And over the course of the Old Testament, you get glimpses of a bit more, but it's really when you get to Jesus and the resurrection that many of our confidence get poured into. There's the developmental quality. I mean, it's not that God hasn't been communicating with us. There's a number of wonderful texts in scripture that say, in spite of all this, I completely trust you. You know, and I think that's what, what we probably need to hear as we, they're not where we are. We know things they do not know. But in spite of how little they know they can trust God. And you can see the beginning of the glimmer of, and if I can trust God, then I can suppose this about when I die. You get glimmers of
Yes.
that you will not, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me.
With me.
I don't know what's gonna happen, but I know you're gonna be with me.
Right, no matter what.
Right.
Yeah, great.
If I could build on that just a little bit. God is the being who created the universe. It's a tremendous God. By definition, humans are limited in their understanding. So we can't help but struggle to understand the mind of God. And we do the best we can with what he reveals to us.
No, that's exactly right. And that's why there are so many different kinds of texts, right? Because they struggle with it in the text.
So he wants us to find him,
That's right.
As best we can.
to understand the struggle,
And I struggle all the time.
or never.
Some things I won't understand until I pass on them, sure.
Yeah, Scott.
So which is the negative? Is the negative that you're dying and you don't want to die? Or is the negative that Sheol is a bad place? And I don't think we've heard that yet, that Sheol is a bad place or a good place.
Yeah, it is not revealed as a place of punishment. Right? But it's a place of death. We're going to see in Ecclesiastes, right? Where everybody goes there. So there's this imagination of what is it? Right.
Right.
And so it's only a bad place. I mean, it really isn't. It's neutral, right? But because the dead go there.
Right.
But
So the negative here is that you're gonna die. That's what we want to avoid, is dying.
or dying prematurely.
Yeah.
So if you're cautioned like this, right, in
It's
Proverbs.
about the premature death and not about the place that's bad that you're going.
That's right,
Okay.
because the emphasis is so much on living with God in the present, right? That a good death would mean that you were faithful to God during your life, you attended to your responsibilities, you made good choices, and in the course of time, you died, right? And God was with you in that whole process. A bad death, right, which you read about, would be someone like this who died prematurely, doing things they weren't supposed to do. Got into all kinds of trouble, abandoned God, walked away, forgot who God was. Right. And I think that's that's where you find the goodness and the badness is in the life, as opposed to in the death. Yeah.
Well, and again, we're trying to put our 22nd century sensibilities to 4,000 or 5,000 year
Yeah.
BC lifestyle. These were people who lived a short, violent life, male and female. You could be killed at any time from an invading army, from a disease. You know, so when everything appears to be out to get you, you have to wonder, okay, if I live with God and I make the right choices, I can avoid these things.
That's right.
Because Sheol, right now, to them, Sheol is a place where everyone goes. It just depends upon what you did and how you lived. I mean, we could also take this, this could also be, he's talking about a prostitute. And there could be
Yeah, that's what
diseases involved with that, and
broken homes, broken marriages, all of those kinds of things.
but that's what it's there isn't a heaven or a hell, there's just life and
And
Sheol.
Sheol, that's it.
That's it. You don't know what happens after you die. No one's come back yet.
Mhm.
So you just, it's a place you don't want to be
Mhm.
prematurely.
Right. That's right. That's right. So let's go to Ecclesiastes. That's the next thing here. 9 verse, all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God, right? That's what we've just been talking about. Whether it's love or hate, one does not know. Everything that confronts them is vanity, since the same fate comes to all, right? To the righteous and to the wicked, to the evil, to the good and to the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to those who sacrifice and those who do not sacrifice. As are the good, so are the sinners. Those who swear are like those who shun an oath. This is an evil in all that happens under the sun, that the same fate comes to everyone. The hearts of all are full of evil, madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. Right? Now, this is, I'm not saying, why don't we be sure we understand, this is a voice, right? In the Hebrew Bible, there are many different kinds of perspectives that are in conversation with each other, right? This one here, right, is the one that talks about the same fate coming to everyone. Now, I'll say that next week, right, hang on with me till next week. Next week, we're going to now then pivot to where we find these glimmers of resurrection. There's 2 of them, right? They're obscure, but yet they're the first signs that something else is going to happen after this, right? But we got to pass through this part first. Does that make sense? Right. So I have a question, and I want to come back to the conversation that you raised with Adam and Eve, because it's a really good one. Everything that confronts them is vanity. That is a really that's a really hard word to translate, but I'm going to tell you what it is. You recognize it from the very first words in Ecclesiastes, right? Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, right? That word there is hevel. In Hebrew, it means vapor, It is the name of Abel. Now, go back to the story of Cain and Abel, right? Havel and Cain, the same exact word, right? The story of Cain and Abel is what? Two people bring a sacrifice. The one who brings the pleasing sacrifice is Havel, vapor. The one who brings the other sacrifice, Cain, right? Cain, which has to do with production and toil and things that you do when you work with your hands and you work a lot, right? Right. So the one who brings the sacrifice that God gazes at and favors is the one who dies. Cain lives. The one who brings the sacrifice, the Havel, the vapor, dies. Now, that is a wisdom, even though it's a story and it's the beginning of the Bible, it is characteristic of a wisdom text that asks a really important question, right? And that question is this: do you do the right thing in life? Do you please God in life because you get a reward at the end? Or do you do it because it's the right thing to do? Abel did the right thing, but Cain is the one who lived. You see the problem here? And so the Hebrew Bible would suggest, now this is without everything we know later in the New, right? That a life well lived is a life that trusts God no matter what happens. Right? That you don't serve God because there's a reward later. You serve God because serving God is the best way to live. That make sense? And I think that's a real question for us even, is an ethical question of, do we do the right thing because it's the right thing to do? Or do we only do the right thing because we're going to get a reward at the end? Right? In other words, I always risk getting in trouble when I but I think it's something we have to think about. Think about this.
Can I offer it in other words?
Yes, and I'll just say it.
Jesus had no ego.
Very good. Yeah. That works.
I want to say that last.
No, you're right. That's a good
Jesus
way to
had
say
no
it.
ego.
Mhm. He did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. So, Ecclesiastes is often read as a really depressing book, right? But it asks us these really hard existential questions, right? That really make us think about what motivates us to make decisions. Because a lot of times the right thing to do is the hard thing to do. And the right thing to do, we don't always get recognized for it. And we don't always get paid what we should, or we don't always get the benefit we think we should have. Right? And it's a lot easier to do the wrong thing to gain a benefit. Yeah, John.
But with my simple mind,
Mhm.
when I compare my choices, I'm gonna try to live a good life, because it's the right thing to do, versus living a life because someone has threatened me, right? Living out of fear that something bad is going to happen to me. I want to live that life. What kind of life is that?
Right. Yeah. Mhm. It is.
And it is kind of the life that Cain gets. That's the first thing he said. The first thing he says to God, because God confronts him, is even though Havel is dead, his blood is crying to God.
Mhm.
So, that's another interesting metaphor right there. But the fact is, now that I've done this, everyone's going to want to kill me. So how am I going to be protected?
Mhm.
So his big concern is that.
That's right.
So it's, I mean, it's the first thing that comes up.
He lived, but he did not live well. Right? Survival is not maybe all it's cracked up to be. So at any rate, let me take you, well, in our few minutes left, to the prophets. In the prophets, when Sheol is mentioned, it really is a way of talking about undoing a structure of power. Right? The imagination is, for example, Habakkuk. The Babylonians, now this refers to Babylonian captivity, open their throats wide as Sheol, like death. They never have enough. They gather all nations for themselves and collect all people as their own. Right? It's a statement of the oppressor, Babylon, oppressor of Israel, who wants to just gobble up all they can for themselves. Right. And it's a swallowing, right? That's that power I talked about at the beginning. Probably a more, but it also, Isaiah uses it also to talk about Jerusalem's rulers. You know, my people go into exile without knowledge. Their nobles are dying of hunger and their multitude is parched with thirst. Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure. The nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude go down, all her throng and all who exalt her. People are bowed down, everyone is brought low. And now here's the key, the eyes of the haughty are humbled. Why would Isaiah want to say something like this? What do you think? And the context is one of exile. Yeah, and
Well, I mean, taken from their country, they're not in power anymore. This other nation, this other king is in power. And, so they're just maybe trotting along with everyone else. They're brought low, equal with everyone, the women, the slave.
everything, right? And they're brought low, why? Last line. They're the haughty.
That's vanity.
It's the vanity, right? It's the pride, right? This is that death as great equalizer. Like when you think of someone who is a tyrant, right? One of the things the tyrant doesn't ever count on is dying. But yet when the prophets are talking about Israel and nations, they're talking about death is what humbles the proud. Right? Because that is the meaning of the equalization, right? Right. If a nation can't be conquered, their king will eventually die. Right. So Isaiah 14 talks about the king of Babylon. It imagines the king of Babylon descending down into Sheol. Right now, it's described, Isaiah 14, verse 3, as a taunt. You know what a taunt is? It's a making fun of, right? It's a mocking, right? And so here the king of Babylon in Isaiah 14 is imagined, it's poetry, right? It's imagined as descending down into Sheol and being greeted by other warriors who say, you have become weak, you have become like us. Right? It's the ultimate humiliation for a tyrant. And so, you know, again, in all of these, it sort of goes back a little bit to the Psalms, where this place of death is imagined as a place of loss of strength, right? For the righteous, but also for the wicked. It's the same fate, right? Whatever power one thinks they have in life, in death, it's gone. Now, here's I'm gonna be mindful of our time, but I want to point you to next week, right? If you are an oppressed nation and you really want to see the king of your oppressor get what they deserve, right? Then the poor, the weak, the downtrodden, the oppressed will get that when the king dies, right? And that system falls. Right? You've got a kind of justice. The question is that enough? Right? Is that enough just for there to be the death of the oppression? Is it enough for someone who has been oppressed to simply experience the same fate? Or is there more? Is there a resurrection? Is there life again for the righteous? Right? And that's the next step in this evolution of what happens that we'll talk about next week. We're done with death, okay? It was really hard to slog through. But it's important to see the background so that you know why resurrection becomes so important. Does that make sense?
So could we call that a good start?
That's a
On the
good,
next chapter.
that's a good start. Yeah, we're gonna start on, we're gonna look at Daniel 12 and Isaiah 26. Next week. And then the full blooming of how resurrection comes into view. Okay?
So if